So today we're here to speak about national reparations policies for survivors of gender-based and sexual violence from Colombia and Mali. And we're very excited to have here with us the president of Musonet Mali and the coordinator for legal affairs for Humanas in Colombia. And before we get started with that, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague, the director of programs at WFM-IGP, who will give us a short introduction into our session today. So this is Angie Manibalan. Please, Angie, take it away.
Thank you for the introduction, and if I'm speaking too fast for the interpretation, just let me know. Greetings and welcome to our event, National Reparations Policies for Survivors of Sexual and Gender-Based Violence, Views from Colombia and Mali, highlighting the work and views of the World Federalist Movement Institute for Global Policies, local partners at Humanas in Colombia and Musonet in Mali. On the heels of the commemoration of the victims of genocide and related crimes yesterday, which focused on international justice and reparations, and to mark Human Rights Day today, we are excited to host this cross-regional dialogue on reparations for survivors of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. This conversation is equally important to commemorate 20 years of the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, which situates reparations within a human rights framework. Reparations are the measures taken by states to redress the harms suffered by victims as a result of gross violations of international human rights law and/or serious violations of international humanitarian law. Domestic law, international human rights treaties, international humanitarian law, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and regional human rights treaties bind states to provide victims with remedies, including reparations, for such violations. But although reparations for sexual and gender-based violence are critical in light of inadequate access to justice in many countries, states have only recently begun to cover sexual violence in reparations programs. Where justice does exist, reparations contribute to preventing victims from perceiving criminal prosecutions as more concerned with punishing the perpetrator than with meeting the needs of victims. Thus, reparations are an essential element of not only the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, but also transitional justice. In Colombia, Mali, and other armed conflicts around the world, reparations must consider the root causes of sexual and gender-based violence that often persist despite ebbs and flows and hostilities. This conversation seeks to unpack challenges and opportunities for reparations in Colombia and Mali and examine the role of global tools such as the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda in ensuring the development and implementation of reparations programs. The World Federalist Movement Institute for Global Policy hopes you enjoy and learn from the upcoming exchange and wishes you all a happy Human Rights Day. Thank you. Back to you, Jessie.
Thank you so much, Angie. That was a beautiful framing. I think we're all very excited for this important discussion, so I don't want to take too much more time before we transition. So for the purposes of interpretation, we're all going to switch to our channels. If you're not already in the channel that you see on your screen, we're going to move to French so that Mama Koité Doumbouya, the president of Musonet, can speak to us. And then to ease logistical concerns, we will do the Q&A part broken up into two spots. So first, after Mama Koité shares her thoughts with us, we can ask her questions. And then for the second half, we will hear from Viviana Rodriguez Peña, and she will share with us in Spanish, and then we can ask her questions. And then there will be a moment at the end if there's any burning remaining questions that we can address those as well. So without further ado, we can all switch to the French language input settings for ourselves. So if you are listening in English, please select the English channel on the bottom of your screen. If you are listening in Spanish, you can select the Spanish channel, and the French will be in the original audio. Alors, à introduire Mama Koité Doumbia. C'est beaucoup. Elle est engagée depuis plus de 30 ans pour les droits des femmes africaines et la paix. Mama Koité Doumbia est présidente de Musonnet Mali depuis 2004.
Thank you for your words to the World Federalist Movement and Jessica for organizing this event. And I'm very happy because it means a lot to all of us. I'm very happy to be able to speak to you about our experiences regarding all of the violence that women and girls suffer in our country. We know that in Mali, you have made a lot of progress in terms of sexual violence, and this has led to be able to fight against the stigmatization of victims and be able to provide more support for them. How do you define this progress? Can you tell us a bit about this progress? Well, thank you for the question. Since 2012, we have been in the midst of a crisis that has led to, for the first time in our country, women and girls being victims of violence, especially sexual violence, and also physical violence, especially in the north and the center of Mali. Many women have been raped, even by multiple men, and we have women that have been tortured and also have been forced to enter into marriages. And they have had to wear the burqa and not show any part of their face. And they cannot transport themselves. They cannot mobilize themselves freely. This has been curtailed. And this crisis has led women to become a large group of victims that need a lot of our support. This is why we started to work on the issue of impunity. And for this, we had to give tools to our civil society organizations, to our media outlets, and to all stakeholders involved to help them understand how we can fight against these scourges. And the ICC can also help us in this fight so that we may reach a solution and we can do something special for these women. To this end, we have a new program that has asked us to go ahead in the training of trainers that will then be able to help these women in the National Peace and Reconciliation Program. We have also trained 25 journalists, both men and women. They have also joined our program. And we have also brought in men and women from civil society. And in 2 weeks, we will have a training session with judges, policemen, members of the Navy, to give them tools so they understand how we will protect victims of sexual violence and how we can avoid this type of violence in the future. We also have to give them, we also have to give our political class an awareness of the problems that the victims are facing. And we need to work with the media to this and promote the rights of these victims throughout the country so that we can change the status or the way these victims are perceived in our country. This is the work that we have to do because we have to overcome this stigma. We have brought in and engaged other national institutions and authorities, and also entities within the legal branch so that we can take all legal action as well in favor of victims and so they can get legal protection. Another important action that we have taken is create awareness among the population. Resolution 1325 has been made visible throughout the country, but we haven't reached all of society or as many as we need. We need all our country to know Resolution 1325 and apply it. What is most important now is that Mali has begun a national program. It started 3 weeks ago. It was launched by the Prime Minister with the support of the Ministry for Women. So we need help translating Resolution 1325 into all languages and dialects that we have in our country because we are multilingual. We need 1325 to be in all of the languages that are used in our country, languages and dialects, so that we can all be on the same page and work on this document together. We need women throughout the country to be able to appear before their counterparts and share their stories. So do you think that you can help us do more events on the radio and on the television to reach many more people so that other women can come forward and share their experience? Yes, thank you. In terms of reparation, we could talk about the challenges that you see for women having access to reparation policies. I know that you have worked on your national reparation policy. So could you please describe the process and what are the recommendations on how to fight against stigmatization and social prejudices? What can we do to ensure that this will not curtail women's access to reparation? I think this is a very important question. I had already talked about a document where the government has written down their commitment, but this is a policy that is still a proposal stage. It has not been adopted because of the pandemic or after the crisis. We signed a peace agreement between different stakeholders, both from the government and from civil society. And even though it does talk about the victims and how to protect them, how to repair them, how to provide reparation for them, there have been many obstacles. So we have had to look for other mechanisms so that this peace agreement would be followed up on and held accountable. We want to create a commission that follows up on the peace agreement. And we also need to understand what is happening with the victims during the process, because they are the central parties to the peace agreement, because there is too many violence that has been exerted on women. So women have to be included in the peace agreement. They have to be central players. They are central actors. They cannot be left to one side. And this is what happens with the types of agreements. They do not include, they leave by the side of the road the real important parties, which are the victims. You might know the situation in our country, which is that women have always been isolated, ostracized. They have never had much participation in our country's history. And so many are very afraid to come forward and share their experience. Women's participation and women speaking out is not part of our customs, of our cultural behavior. So we need the Ministry for Women to work on this throughout the country. And it could also invite other ministries to do so. The Ministry of the Women has invited many women to come forward and talk about the violence that they have suffered. But what is the problem? The problem is that we also need to take into account the situation that these women live in their day-to-day lives. These women that have suffered rapes and have become pregnant, for example, women have been affected psychologically, deeply affected. Also, some have been affected materially, economically, and this is why we have created the National Commission for Justice and Reparation. Human rights also have to become visible. We need to create visibility and awareness on the human rights of these women because they have suffered greatly. And to this end, we have to help all ministries in the country adopt Resolution 1325. But now, what is the problem with this policy? The problem is that we have to categorize, because these reparations need to be calculated for. It's not the same when you have a physical damage or economic damage, but victims of rape, victims of other types of violences need to be repaired both physically and legally. So the problem was drafting a document that incorporated all of these ideas. Another problem is that the men have to be included in this as well, and we have to show them that the really vulnerable populations are our women and children, because in the past, the economic repairs, these indemnizations, went to the men. So we also need to create a document that collects all of the testimonies from these women and seek for a collective repairment that really has their best interests at heart. We also have to make this document public, because most of these testimonies have not been made public. They are reserved. We also need to talk about mutilations, which is a very delicate subject. And so we need to look for drafting a series of policies that really take into account the social situation in our country and thus avoid stigmatization. When these victims have gone through these horrible experiences, we have to heal them. We have to give them help. medical help and psychological help. And we also need to repair them legally. There are a series of steps for this. Each has its own particularities, each process. For example, in our communities and in our neighborhoods, we have to explain that when a member of their community has suffered this type of violence, we have to have solidarity as a community for them. We cannot re-victimize them. They cannot remain hidden victims. They need to be able to get their lives back on track and reestablish all of their rights, all of their human rights. There is a fund available which was launched in the 30th of June in Bamako, and we will start by the reparation for these victims. And throughout this process, we have had the help of a team that has been asked to have women's and children's interests at the center of their actions. And also, we executed or displayed a program for the women of Timbuktu, because previously we had a lot of activity in that region due to tourism, and tourism has gone away. So we need to help them to find another economic activity. And for this, we need to go there to the communities and listen to them and hear them out in what their needs are and help them to make a living. We have another program that is supported by Canada and other countries. And Canada, for example, has been able to show many results. Needs to be a program that really helps women reinsert themselves into society and become a dignified member of their society once again. To this end, we have to launch campaigns to create awareness against stigmatization so that all victims have the right to get their life back on track and regain their dignity. So we wish to be able to accompany them in their reinsertion into society, so to speak. They need to be able to take back their lives, and we need to help the community understand that they have to help them do this so that we can create true peace. Thank you very much. I see that you have worked a lot throughout your country, and as you mentioned, you have been working on also a policy for inclusion. So my question is, how do we do reparation at the local level? What are the obstacles that you have encountered so that these victims are not re-victimized and they can have access to reparation? There are many women's victims association, which is very important. They are involved in the process. They have created these organizations themselves because victims in the past are marginalized. So we have worked with these organizations so that the concept of inclusion is always present in all of our actions, and in the future they will be included in government policy. And if one of our organizations is not upholding this principle of inclusion, then we have to call them up on it. I wanted to point out that the strategy that we want to deploy is to oversee that all existing structures or that will be implemented in the future, women have to be represented in all of them. And this is the key aspect. And this has to do with communication. Communication is a very important element because, as I was saying, there are many languages and dialects within our country, and it is important that each community can access this information in their own tongue. Thank you, Mama. I have another question. And this question is regarding the mechanisms and also Resolution 1325. Over the next couple of years, how do you plan to deploy the framework of Resolution 1325 so that it would lead to justice and reparation? As I was saying, in this new action plan that was created by and launched by the Prime Minister together with the Ministry for Women, the Minister also works very closely with us, and there is a very important role to play there, which is of the ministry, but the civil society has also played its role and do the right thing and follow up on the implementation of 1325. And this committee will present a series of actions, an action plan that has been drawn together with civil society, because the government cannot work alone. It has to involve all stakeholders and agree with them. Tomorrow, we will have a meeting together with the delegates from the UN in our country. And this comes from a timeline that we have created with them. And we also have Law 52, which was passed in 2015, which talked about women's representation at the political level. So we also need to follow up on this because this law establishes that there needs to be a 35% participation of women. The UN Women Program also has its own metrics. Together with other UN organizations, we have talked about the fact that we need to create an observatory. This observatory will have under its purview overseeing how this agreement is implemented, what has been achieved and what has not been achieved, and we need to create reports to be able to make decisions so that these matters regarding women and gender come to fruition. For this, we need to involve women, engage women, and ask them how we can help them in their physical, economic, and legal reparation. I hope this mechanism is launched soon here in Bamako. Together with the sponsorship of the government of Norway, we can create this observatory so that they can also help disseminate information throughout our country, so that this information does not stay at the local level, which is another of the risks we face, that this information just stays at the local level. We need that The Hague follows up as well on this process of rehabilitation and reintegration and reparation of the victims, oversee how women have been taken into account in public policy and how they have been helped to become productive members of society, that they have the proper representation throughout society and throughout government. And this is both at the urban and rural levels. I have a lot of faith in this observatory so that it can also create data that can help us create actions that have more impact, and that we may also leave the big cities and reach our rural areas. This is the objectives of creating such an observatory. We have another question. This is regarding involving religious leaders in these initiatives. Well, you know that in Mali, we have a lot of pressure coming from religious leaders on women's organizations. And using the notion of the family, these religious leaders start making decisions, and they also have a lot to do with these arranged marriages and inheritances and religious marriages. This is something that we have had to document because the government has a role to play there, which is that marriage should not always be a religious marriage, but it also needs to be registered legally. Now we're talking about the issue of legal and illegal marriages and forced marriages and religious marriages. This is a big challenge that the government faces. Many times these religious leaders are opposed to public administration decisions, and they also exert a lot of pressure on civil society. And for example, regarding the issue of genital mutilation, this has also been a problem. And we have to be able to show the negative effect on girls when we adopt these type of practices. There's a lot to be done in favor of human rights, as you might see. We hope that, well, unfortunately, because of the military regime that we are under now, the power of the religious organizations has been lessened, decreased, and this is a positive aspect of being under a military regime, that they took away some of the power from the religious institutions. This is not to say that this is an ideal situation, but we have more democracy and the state can take more control on a series of aspects that concern women's livelihoods. The issue with religious leaders is that many times politicians use them for or against because of their own interests. And this has done a lot of damage to us in the past. Today, thanks to social media, things have gotten better because this technology has helped us, people speaking out and speak their minds. And so we are going to make the best use of it. This is a tool, an instrument that can be really helpful to create awareness on the duties of the religious authorities. That was very interesting. I wish we could continue with this, but we have another guest, and so now we have to bring Mama's intervention to an end. But thank you so much. I hope that we overcome this COVID pandemic quickly so that we can meet face to face, because these virtual events do not really live up to what could be done in person. I hope so too. So now we will hand the floor over to Viviana and we will change channels. Please, everybody, seek out the channel of your language of choice. Now we will switch to Spanish so that I may introduce Viviana Rodriguez Peña. Viviana is a lawyer specializing in human rights, and she is studying a master's degree in political studies and has experience in accompanying, representing victims of human rights violations and communities with a focus on gender and a differential approach. She has participated in programs to bring access to justice for LGBTI communities. She's worked on public policy with a gender approach. She's worked as a human rights defender. She's worked on collective reparation and has worked on helping women become leaders, social leaders. She is right now the legal director of Mali and Colombia. And so, Viviana, thank you very much, Jessica. For us, it is an honor to be able to share this virtual platform with Mama Coité, because we recognize that an alliance of women is what will allow us to transform our world. And without a doubt, the countries that are still under an armed conflict need to find an alternative, and these alternatives need to be devised and built by women. I say it because I was struck by Mama's words regarding the powers that be, and how we need to face up to religious powers and also armed groups that are mostly men that determine the lives of women. Together with Humanas, we wanted to share with you today some of our considerations regarding what reparation is for victims that have been women that have been victims of sexual violence in Colombia. And we need to start by recognizing that the armed conflict in Colombia, as in Mali, has been long drawn. It has been with us for many decades and has hurt many thousands of people. And even though in Colombia we have worked over decades to achieve peace with different illegal armed groups, it has only been in the last 15 years that these efforts have included participation of women that have been victims of the violence. We see how women are still suffering violence, despite the fact that we signed a peace agreement in 2016. Even in some regions, we see more violence. And today, this year, we have seen that because of the pandemic, women are even more vulnerable, for example, in terms of working and creating their livelihood, but also they have had less access to justice and to healthcare. And we are very concerned because this can create consequences that will remain for them for years. So, as a first point, we wanted to tell you that in Colombia, we have several processes or policies regarding victims of the armed conflict. In general terms, as a victim of any type of violence, you can ask for reparation before the courts. But we also have two transitional justice schemes that are ongoing. One that began in 2005 for the victims of paramilitary groups, and also some victims of guerrilla groups. Under the scheme, judges could order reparations be made. A second transitional justice scheme that is ongoing, derived from the peace agreement signed in 2016, where it established we create a mechanism for justice, peace, reparation, truth, and non-reparation. Formally, it includes measures for reparation, and it also talks about sanctions that need to be applied to those responsible for violations of human rights or crimes against humanity or crimes of war. And these sanctions have to have as an aim the reparation of said victims. However, the first thing that I wanted to share with you is that this multiplicity of social, political agreements, procedures, transitional justice schemes has not made women's access to reparation easier. This is explained by two factors. One, which has to do with the effects of the types of violence that these women have suffered, and the other has to do with the structure of these transitional justice schemes. Regarding the first factor, well, we know that sexual violence and gender-based violence is used to submit members of society, especially women and the LGBTI population. This control is also exerted through the victims' bodies, but also it extends to them as members of a family, as a community. And sexual violence has been used as a war tactic, as a strategy of war. So the fact that the conflict is still raging on lessens the possibility of the opportunities for women to talk about the violence they have suffered. And additionally, despite all of the transitional justice schemes or ordinary justice processes, no armed legal or illegal group has accepted that they have used sexual violence as a strategy of war. And we need to add this to the silence and the shame that society exerts on victims. Victims are judged, and this leads to their silence. They do not come forward and speak out. And another consequence of this is that if they do not get the opportunity to speak out, then they will not have access to reparation either. They cannot gain access to reparation. This is what all of our women's organizations and NGOs are working for, because we are key stakeholders in the process of creating the proper scenario for women to speak out. We need to create safe, adequate, respectful scenarios in which they can explain their case, and also where we can explain to them the requirements of them accessing reparation. And the second factor is that the multiplicity of entities, processes, procedures makes reparation more difficult for women to access. If we take into account that our participation as women before the state, the relationship that we as women have with the state is very nascent. For example, in rural areas, most women, be it because of the patriarchal culture or our conservative society, they have a very little relationship, an non-existent relationship with the state, and this leads to them not knowing that they have rights, and that they have also the right to demand the state to repair and uphold their rights. We also understand that public administration is quite slow, and this is another damage that women suffer: the slow pace at which the government operates, and this leads to more vulnerability, and this translates into a lack of trust, and they feel that the government is not there for women, and especially women that have been victims of sexual violence. I wanted to share with you a recent experience regarding access to reparation for women in Colombia. This is an example coming from the transitional justice scheme that the Special Jurisdiction for Peace has implemented, whereby they will prosecute violence against women perpetrated by the FARC members, some members of the armed forces, and some third civilians that appear voluntarily. In one case, we have documented 20 women being involved, and when we reviewed where their reparation process is at, we found that of the 20 women that we represent, only 7 of them are in the official registry as victims of sexual violence. And of those 20, most of them, 16, are registered, but for other facts, which is to say that the government has not recognized them as victims of sexual violence, but as victims of forced displacement. These women that are already on the victims registry, be it for sexual violence or forced displacement, tell us that they do not know the status of their case, and when we trace it, the information is incomplete, mistakes have been made by government officials, and we see that they will have to go through additional legal procedures, additional to the request for reparation, to number one, obtain information, and then to obtain the reparation as such. Of the women that are not recognized as victims of sexual violence, we find that most of them did not know, they were not aware that they could come forward and express that they were victims of sexual violence. They were not comfortable, which is to say that when they told the public official that they were victims of sexual violence, they couldn't do so in a scenario of trust and security that is needed to be able to talk about sexual violence. And some of them also have told us that talking about sexual violence may lead to them being stigmatized in their communities, or that the illegal armed groups that remain in their territories could signal them out as a risk to their interest, and they could be re-victimized by these illegal groups. Under the victims law that created victims registry, there is a rule regarding the time that victims had to register themselves. In some cases, we can appeal to force majeure, but this implies further legal procedures, even having to appear before the higher courts, the constitutional courts, just to be able to have access to the registry, not even the reparation, just the previous step, which is being within the sole registry for victims. Additionally, we have found 5 women that have told us that they were able to talk about the sexual violence they suffered, but they were not included in the registry. There was a mistake made by the public official that took down their testimony and denied their recognition as a victim of sexual violence. And to date, our conclusion is of these 20 women, none of them has been repaired or has received reparation, nor integral reparation. What is integral reparation? To receive money, indemnization, which is tantamount to the level of violence which they were subject to, but also access to rehabilitation through psychosocial attention and other types of health-related rehabilitation. And this is just the microcosm of 20 women that allows us to see the macrocosm of the situation of women in Colombia. Now I would like to talk a bit more about how reparation is moving in Colombia, which can tell us a bit about how reparation could operate in the future, thinking of effective reparation. One of the ideas that we have is that in the peace agreement that was signed in 2016, it included the need to have a national rural health plan. That is, that rural population had, for the first time, real access to healthcare. If this plan includes, as the peace agreement establishes, a gender-based approach and brings healthcare to women, especially reproductive health and psychosocial attention, maybe this plan could become part of a collective action of reparation and a measure for creating non-repetition of sexual violence. It is important that these types of measures are implemented. However, we need more political will and we need more commitment from the national government to implement the peace agreement as was signed. The second idea that we have is that there are ongoing global debates and national debates aimed at non-repetition and to offer guarantees for reproductive health for the victims of sexual violence. And one of these debates is eliminating abortion as a crime and creating access to women to proper abortion procedures. The issue here is how women undermine women's autonomy and reduces their control over their own bodies. So national debates as legalizing abortion will also reinforce women's autonomy over their bodies and make them subjects of all the human rights that they deserve. Another part of the work that our organization has done with victims of sexual violence that are part of the Afro-Colombian community is that when we worked with them and talked about the side effects of this type of violence, they employed the African concept of wunzu, which says that sexual violence against a woman is an attack against the community, and therefore justice and reparation need to contribute to the reparation of their community, to restore the social fabric and the relationships that they had within their community. This is relevant in terms of reparation because it can lead to the necessary cultural transformations that guarantee women's rights in the future. We have several ideas for this. For example, scenarios where we need to tackle the cultural idea whereby women belong to men, to their fathers, to their leaders, and therefore tackle the stigmatization, because sometimes even the legal authorities appear to justify violence or signal these women, be it because of their way they dress, because of their line of work. They did not exert enough resistance or made themselves or put themselves in a position to receive this type of violence. And being blamed like this does not entail only what happened to their bodies, but how this body needs to be able to coexist in society once again. And if I look back on something that Mama Coita said already, which is the issue of collaboration and participation. Women in Colombia and the reparation in Colombia needs to start by listening to women and listen to them in what they need for their reparation. Nothing else will make do. Reparation for victims of sexual violence needs to start with the victims and listening to them and be created by them. And with this, I end my intervention. Thank you. Thank you, Viviana. This was an excellent overview of the situation, and also you also brought some very interesting details of the work that Humanas has done. And you also covered, yes, many interesting details. So I thank you. You mentioned the issue of shame, shaming, stigmatization, other types of violence. So what are the most effective ways of overcoming stigmatization and social prejudices? And on the other hand, is there something that you have seen that is even counterproductive that is being used in trying to overcome these challenges? For us, the starting point is creating scenarios where there is trust, where women can speak about what happened to them. In Colombia, we have documented several experiences where activities that are not cataloged under reparation is where women have found the trust they need to be able to speak out. And once some women speak out, other women are more likely to come forward, and whereby women can leave behind the guilt and shame that they feel. In terms of reparation, we see that we need more political will to maintain a gender-based approach, and the differential approach is also a determining factor to create strategies that are effective for reparation, as well as scenarios where we can question and challenge what is being done, which involves participation by women. Gender-based approach sometimes comes up in a law and a regulation, but translating into reality has been a challenge. And also we need to understand that this is the responsibility and the commitment of the government. So when a new administration comes in, this is continued by the new administration. When the Justice and Law Transitional Justice Scheme came in, there was a specific process for reparation that try to create these safe places, and also try to work on what women could do to move back into the workforce when they were repaired and received their indemnization. But these programs were neglected by new administrations. So it is important that women's organizations and international organizations continue to pressure our government so that the gender-based approach becomes a reality. Not that it is included in the laws and regulations, but a true follow-up on it being implemented in reality. For example, Resolution 1325 needs to be overseen very closely to see how this resolution is implemented, and all related resolutions, how we move from the discourse into reality and true impact for women. And regarding victims of sexual violence in rural communities, how do you feel that we can have proper reparation mechanisms for them? And what is the relationship now between stigma and implementation at the local level? Well, we have a series of challenges. For example, in the case of the 20 women that I mentioned, these are also 20 Afro-Colombian women, and we also have to contend with racial discrimination, a racial discrimination that is tied to poverty. And this condition creates more difficulties for women to have access to reparation and even to live them as rights. These populations that have been condemned by racial discrimination to poverty, their relationship with the government is established as a series of benefits and programs that come in to try to bring them out of poverty, but not an exercise of their human rights. So with them, we have been through many processes so that they understand themselves as citizens, and citizens that were victims of violence, that they understand their right to justice, to truth, to reparation. At the local level, we also have many more difficulties of involving local administrations that have very difficult political relationships. They have been traditionally plagued by corruption and also have very few resources derived from the structural inequalities that we see in our country. And we also need to understand that these local administrations have lived through decades of armed conflict, which is to say that these authorities have been permeated by the dynamics of the armed conflict, be it that they serve the interests of an armed group or another. However, the process that these women have gone through is very important because they understand themselves as owners of rights, brings them to a higher plane, and they understand that they can demand the state that these rights are upheld. They can complain and demand that they receive the proper care and up-to-date information. And this is a way to empower and strengthen their women and also their social fabric, because sometimes these women become not only social leaders, but also community role models. This also brings more risks to them. As you know, human rights advocates are stigmatized, signaled, and also victims of crimes that fall into impunity. So I think that we need to continue to work with women because the government has still not done what it needs to do to be there for them. So seen from another angle, in Colombia, as we see in other conflicts around the world, we have seen that even after the conflict ends formally, sexual or gender-based violence even increases in some cases. So how has this affected reparation efforts? What do these facts mean for women and to survivors in general? And how can reparation contribute towards changing these structural dynamics for all, even for those victims that are not covered by the terms of the peace agreement? I should highlight here that within this last peace agreement that was signed in 2016, the process led by our women forced the parties to accept our participation. This implied that we could incorporate several of our positions of the women's rights movements into the written agreement. One of those was the Rural National Health Plan. However, we encountered an obstacle, which is that this peace agreement its implementation is delayed, is lagging. Right now, the current administration has weakened the government's commitment to implementing the peace agreements. And the latest report that we have on implementation of gender-based programs, we only have a progress of 33%. Of the measures that were specifically aimed at tackling gender-based biases. We are also in a critical moment in terms of human rights, because we knew that the peace agreement would not seal a complete peace, because we still have other illegal armed groups. But what the government and other stakeholders have done is to engage in territorial fights, and women are therefore exposed to new forms of sexual violence, especially because we haven't made the step as a society to recognize sexual violence as a strategy of war. As I said, no armed group has ever recognized it. And for this, we need it to be recognized by these groups. And so women continue to be victimized and continue to encounter barriers to their access to reproductive health and health care in general. And reparation measures are not in a position to repair the past, but they continue to repair the present. And this is a very worrying state of affairs that we have brought before many international organizations. And maybe peace will not be consolidated right now and through women and through their participation, then what we will see in the future is an indefinite armed conflict. There's another thing that we talk about in Colombia a lot, which is that peace has to be implemented by women as well. If you exclude us from the peace agreement, if you exclude us from the transformation, if you do not repair women that are being victims, lead us to an incomplete transformation. So the 1325 talks about specific measures, but the idea there is that peace is created by and for women as well. I know that we do not have a lot of time left, so very briefly, can you tell us how you see the future in terms of how the framework of the UN peace and security agreements be developed to bring proper reparation mechanisms to women? Women's movements in Colombia and women's organizations in Colombia that have been working for decades for peace in Colombia are very strong in what we call being advocates of the UN's peace and security agenda, in bringing to reality the programs that women need. And this year, we are creating a series of indicators that the Security Council has proposed as needed to understand if Resolution 1325 is being implemented. Colombia does not have an action plan yet. This is one of the shortcomings, but also it is also symbolic of the lack of the political will of the government. And when we do a follow-up on the government's actions, we have many metrics, many programs, many schemes. And this follow-up through these indicators would allow us to see what real progress has been made, what has materialized really, And also, we will continue to work on programs that could be important in terms of reparation. One of them is an intersectoral analysis so that we can see how this affects racial discrimination, how women that are LGBTI, peace, reparation, the armed conflict in general, how sexual and reproductive health is seen. This is for us, it is very important to establish that women have autonomy over their bodies. And these are all inputs to be able to think about when reparation is done, how can it be made through what we call a transformative approach. Let's look back at having a health system with access to sexual and reproductive health in the rural areas. This could be a huge change, not only for the women that have spoken out as victims of sexual violence, but for all of those women that have not spoken up, that are in risk of being a victim of sexual violence, that could have a different future if they understand from young age that they own their own bodies. So I think that a rigorous follow-up from us and from international organizations, which is not only a formal follow-up, but also a material follow-up, would allow to create opportunities to strengthen peace and security for women, and specifically think about reparations for victims of sexual violence. Once again, thank you so much for both our speakers, and thus we come to the end.
I have to really thank both of our panelists again. This was really a lovely discussion, and I wish that we could go farther, but it was an enjoyable follow-on, I think, to our October event, which was focused more on women, peace, and security framework and how that has looked. So I look forward to continuing the discussion. And, you know, I think we'll see you at CSW in the spring at the very least. So thank you again. Thank you again to NORAD for supporting this conversation. And I hope that everyone has a good evening or rest of your day, depending on wherever you are.